Before the world was torn apart by the thunder of guns and the screams of millions, there was silence. A silence that was not peace, but a fragile stillness stretched thin across the surface of an old continent. Europe, in the early years of the 20th century, carried itself with pride, with an almost careless grandeur. It was an age of kings and emperors, of glittering palaces and processions, of soldiers in polished boots and brass bands that echoed in city squares. It was the illusion of permanence, the dream that the empires of old could stand forever. But beneath the polished surface, shadows gathered. The year was 1914. Four mighty empires dominated the map: the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of nations bound together by a fragile crown; the vast, aging Ottoman Empire, its borders fraying at the edges; the Russian Empire, stretched thin across half the world, ruled by a czar whose grip was weakening; and the British Empire, grand and proud, the sun never setting on its dominions. They stood like ancient statues, heavy with history, but riddled with cracks. Nationalism burned like a quiet fever inside them. People who longed for independence whispered in taverns and cafes. Workers struck in factories. Students read forbidden pamphlets by candlelight. Politicians smiled for the cameras of the day, but behind their eyes, there was worry. The world of 1914 looked outwardly calm, yet it was a calm before the storm. It was the silence before the forest fire. And then, one summer day, a sound broke that silence. In Sarajevo, on the morning of June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, rode in an open car with his wife Sophie. They were dressed in fine clothes, waving politely to the crowd, a parade of honor, a symbol of power. But in the shadows of the city streets waited men who saw not royalty, but oppressors. They carried pistols, and they carried the weight of a cause. One of them, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, stepped forward as the car slowed near a bridge. He raised his weapon. 2 shots cracked through the summer air. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand. The second struck Sophie. And in that moment, in the silence that followed, the world shifted. The Archduke slumped in his seat. Blood spread across his uniform. His wife collapsed beside him. The crowd screamed, scattered, surged. The young assassin was seized, but the damage was already done. In that instant, an empire demanded justice. Another swore vengeance. Alliances stirred, like sleeping giants waking from their slumber. And within weeks, the delicate balance of Europe unraveled into chaos. But let us linger here for just a moment longer. Because history often tells this story as if the assassination itself lit the fire, as if it were a simple spark that ignited the war to come. But the truth is stranger, more unsettling. The fire had already been smoldering for decades. It was waiting for its excuse. The leaders of Europe lived in a world of telegrams, secret pacts, and mutual suspicion. A network of alliances bound the continent like threads of a spider's web, threads invisible to most of the people who would soon bleed because of them. Germany stood at the heart of this web, young, ambitious, restless. France still remembered the humiliation of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, dreaming of revenge, of reclaimed lands. Britain watched with unease as German ships multiplied, threatening its dominance of the seas. Russia, vast and clumsy, dreamed of defending its Slavic brothers in the Balkans. And Austria-Hungary, fearful of the future, clung desperately to the past. When Franz Ferdinand fell in Sarajevo, those threads began to snap. Or perhaps they pulled tighter, dragging nations toward each other, not in peace, but in collision. The summer of 1914 still seemed calm, though. Farmers cut their wheat. Children played in the streets. In Vienna, in Paris, in Berlin, the cafes were filled with talk of politics, of art, of music. Most people went about their lives as though the world were unshakable. But something had shifted. The air itself felt different, heavy, electric. Newspapers blared with headlines of ultimatums, of demands, of deadlines. Politicians gave speeches filled with pride, but also fear. And in the barracks of Europe, soldiers began to prepare. The great powers issued threats, ultimatums, declarations, and slowly, almost mechanically, the world marched toward the abyss. To the common man, it was bewildering. Why should the death of an Austrian prince in a city far from home mean that millions of ordinary men must soon carry rifles and march into fire? Few understood it. Fewer still questioned it. For when the nations called, the people answered. Young men lined up to enlist. They smiled for photographs in their new uniforms. They kissed their mothers, their sweethearts, their sisters goodbye. They sang songs as trains carried them to the front. They believed, truly believed, that they would be home by Christmas. No one could imagine 4 years of slaughter. No one could imagine trenches stretching across the earth like open wounds. No one could imagine gas and tanks and artillery so powerful it shook the ground like earthquakes. No one could imagine the world they were about to enter. But history had already chosen its path. The war was coming. The old world was about to end, and nothing would ever be the same again. This is the story of the war that changed everything. The first tremors of war came not with gunfire, but with words. In late July of 1914, Austria-Hungary, shaken with fury at the death of Franz Ferdinand, delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. Its terms were crushing, humiliating, designed to be rejected. Serbia complied with most of the demands, but not all. And that refusal was enough. Behind the ultimatum stood another power. Germany, ready to back its ally. Behind Serbia stood Russia, determined to protect its Slavic kin. Behind Russia stood France, bound by alliance. And Britain, hesitant, cautious, yet bound to Belgium and to balance, hovered at the edge of decision. The alliances, invisible to the common man, now pulled like chains. One empire's anger became another's cause. One declaration became many. And what should have been a quarrel between two nations began to expand into something vast and uncontrollable. The words were soon followed by orders of mobilization. Orders that sent millions into motion. The world turned to movement. Railway stations filled with soldiers in crisp uniforms, their boots polished, their eyes bright with anticipation. Mothers wept as their sons departed, yet cheered through their tears. Young men, laughing, threw their caps in the air. Bands played marches as trains pulled away. In Berlin, in Paris, in London, the crowds erupted in a fever of enthusiasm. Flags waved, bells rang. Newspapers spoke of honor and glory. Politicians promised victory, swift and certain. Priests blessed the troops as they marched, their voices rising in prayer. It was called the August Madness. A strange intoxication, a collective delusion. For in that first flush of war, men believed they were stepping into history, into adventure. Few understood the abyss into which they marched. The German war plan unfolded with mechanical precision. The Schlieffen Plan, strike France swiftly through Belgium before Russia could rise in strength. On August 4th, German troops crossed the Belgian frontier. Villages that had slept peacefully for centuries awoke to the thunder of boots, the creak of wagons, the rattle of artillery wheels. Belgium resisted bravely, its soldiers outnumbered, its cities battered. Louvain burned. Civilians fled. And the world looked on in horror. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war. And with that act, the last great domino fell. The conflict was no longer regional, it was global. The soldiers of Europe now tasted war for the first time. At Mons, at Charleroi, at the Marne, they met each other in furious clashes. The French, in their bright red trousers and blue coats, charged forward with bayonets shining. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, fought stubbornly against the tide. The Germans advanced with terrifying discipline, their columns precise, their artillery relentless. The ground shook. The air filled with smoke and screams. Machine guns tore through advancing lines, mowing down hundreds in minutes. Shells exploded with such force that men were thrown into the air, torn apart before they could even raise their rifles. It was war, but not the war they had imagined. Not the war of cavalry charges and gallant duels. This was something mechanical, industrial, inhuman. The fighting did not remain on the battlefield alone. Entire nations were now at war. Factories roared to life, producing rifles, shells, uniforms, barbed wire. Families waved goodbye to their sons, and then went to work to support the armies. Women filled the workshops, forging the weapons of destruction. Children gathered scrap metal for recycling. The war was no longer the soldiers' burden alone. It belonged to everyone. Civilians became part of the machine. No one would be untouched. At first, the soldiers still clung to hope. They wrote letters home, filled with excitement, with pride. They told their families not to worry. They believed the war might be short, decisive, heroic. They believed they would be home by Christmas. But as August turned to September, the truth became harder to ignore. Casualties mounted. Families began to receive telegrams of death. Entire units vanished in a single battle. And still, the lines did not move as promised. The Marne brought the German advance to a halt, but not to an end. Both sides bled, both sides dug in. The dream of swift victory was dying, and so the soldiers turned to the earth for protection. At first, they dug shallow ditches, foxholes against the shell fire, but soon the ditches deepened, lengthened, connected. Trenches carved across the countryside, zigzagging for miles. Barbed wire was strung. Sandbags were stacked. Machine gun nests were placed at every angle. From the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland, an unbroken scar now stretched across Europe. The armies had come to a standstill. The war of movement had ended. The war of waiting had begun. The men who had once marched off with laughter now stood knee-deep in mud. They smelled the stench of death lingering in the air. They heard the constant thunder of artillery. They felt the cold, the fear, the endless waiting. The descent was complete. The nations of Europe had stepped into a war unlike any before. A war not of swift victories, but of endurance. A war of trenches, of machines, of silence between bombardments. A war that would not end quickly. A war that would consume them all. The descent into war was no longer a choice. It was a fate, and now the world would learn what that fate meant. By the end of 1914, the armies had dug in. The Western Front stretched from the coast of Belgium to the mountains of Switzerland. Nearly 500 miles of trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, and shell holes. It was not a line drawn on a map. It was carved into the earth itself. The soldiers who entered it did not step into battlefields. They stepped into another world. A world of mud and water, of lice and rats, of constant thunder and sudden silence. A world where the sky flashed with fire and the earth trembled beneath the pounding of guns. A world where weeks passed without movement, yet every day brought death. The Western Front was not just a place. It was a prison. A soldier's life was measured in routine. Dawn brought stand to, rifles ready, eyes peering into the gray mist, waiting for an attack that might never come. Afterward, there was the work of repairing, mending sandbags, draining water, reinforcing walls that collapsed under the weight of rain. Meals, when they arrived, were simple and grim. Bread hard as stone, tins of bully beef, lukewarm tea carried in sloshing containers. Rats grew fat on the scraps, bold enough to crawl over sleeping men. Lice nested in clothing, biting and itching until men scratched themselves raw. Disease crept silently through the ranks. Dysentery, trench foot, fevers, and above it all was the constant fear. Fear of shells that fell without warning, fear of snipers' bullets cracking from unseen places, fear of gas drifting silently through the night, a pale green mist that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. For the men, time slowed. Hours blurred. Days bled into weeks. The trenches swallowed their lives. There was something unnatural in the stillness. After hours, sometimes days, of roaring artillery, the sudden silence was worse than the noise. Men lay awake, listening to the dripping of water, the scurrying of rats, the sound of their own breath. The silence pressed against their minds. They knew it would not last. The guns would speak again. They always did. But in the silence, thoughts came. Memories of home, the faces of mothers, wives, children. Questions whispered to themselves, "Why am I here? Will I ever leave?" And the knowledge, heavy, unshakable, that death might come at any moment. Some went mad in those silences. Some prayed. Some simply stared blank into the mud. The Western Front was not only a battlefield of flesh and steel, it was a battlefield of the mind. In 1916, the storm broke at Verdun. The Germans launched their great offensive against the French fortress city. Their goal was not merely to take it, but to bleed France dry. "Bleed them white," their leaders said. For 10 months, Verdun burned. The French, under General Pétain, swore they would not surrender. "They shall not pass," became the cry of the nation. And so men were thrown into the fire, week after week, month after month. The air was filled with the shriek of shells, the crash of explosions, the endless cries of the wounded. Hills were torn apart until they were unrecognizable. Forests were reduced to charred stumps. Villages were ground into dust. When it ended, hundreds of thousands were dead or wounded. Verdun had become a symbol of sacrifice, of endurance, of horror. A place where men gave everything and gained nothing. If Verdun was France's battle, the Somme was Britain's. On July 1st, 1916, British soldiers climbed from their trenches and advanced across open fields, confident that days of bombardment had destroyed the German defenses. They walked slowly, shoulder to shoulder, as if on parade. But the wire was not cut. The machine guns were not silenced, and in minutes the slaughter began. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were casualties. 20,000 lay dead, the single bloodiest day in British history. And yet, the battle raged on for months. The ground turned to mud as shells churned it into a wasteland. Men drowned in craters filled with water. Horses sank and disappeared. The dead could not be buried. They lay where they fell, mingling with the living. When the Somme finally ended, more than 1 million men had been killed or wounded, and the front line had barely moved. The Western Front became a laboratory of death. Machine guns raked the fields. Poison gas drifted in clouds, chlorine, phosgene, mustard, each more terrible than the last. Men coughed until their lungs filled with blood, clawed at their throats, stumbled blindly into the wire. Artillery grew larger, louder, more destructive. The great guns could be heard for miles, shaking the earth like storms. Entire units disappeared under barrages that seemed to have no end. And then, in 1916, something new appeared. The tank. Massive, armored beasts crawling slowly across the mud, spitting fire from their guns. Clumsy at first, but terrifying to those who faced them. The machine age had entered the battlefield, and it would never leave. The war had become not just human against human, but industry against industry. A contest of machines as much as men. The Western Front was a scar across the land. Villages that had stood for centuries were obliterated. Forests were reduced to skeleton trees. Rivers ran black with mud and blood. Craters pocked the fields filled with stagnant water. For those who fought there, the world shrank to mud, wire, fire, and death. The sky was always gray. The earth was always broken. The air was always heavy with smoke. To step into the Western Front was to step into a landscape that no longer belonged to the living. In the end, the Western Front was defined not only by battles but by waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for rations, waiting for bombardments, waiting for death. The dead themselves became part of the landscape. Buried shallowly in trenches, their bodies resurfaced after rains. Faces half visible in the mud, hands reaching from the earth. The living walked among them daily, unable to escape the reminder of what they too might become. And yet, life went on. Letters were written. Songs were sung. Jokes were told. Men clung to fragments of humanity in a place that seemed designed to erase it. This was the Western Front. Not a place of victory, but of endurance. Not a place of glory, but of survival. The Western Front was more than a battlefield. It was a world within a world where time itself seemed to stop, where men lived like ghosts and died like shadows. The war was not confined to the mud of Flanders or the ruins of France. It spread outward, like a fire leaping from one field to the next, consuming everything in its path. From the icy plains of Eastern Europe, to the deserts of the Middle East, to the jungles of Africa and the oceans of the world, the Great War reached places most had never imagined. It was not just Europe's war anymore. It was the world's. To the east, a different war unfolded. Where the Western Front froze into stalemate, the Eastern Front was vast, fluid, shifting. The Russian Empire, massive, clumsy, unprepared, faced the disciplined armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The fields of East Prussia saw the disaster of Tannenberg, where Russian soldiers were encircled, captured by the tens of thousands, their columns stretching endlessly into captivity. At the Masurian Lakes, another defeat, bodies sinking into marshes, bayonets flashing in the mist. But the Russians fought on, hurling millions of men into the fire. Victories came too, in Galicia, against Austria-Hungary, Whole provinces changed hands, villages burned, refugees fled by the millions. It was a war of movement, yes, but it was also a war of immense suffering, hunger, cold, disease. Soldiers marched for days, ill-clothed, half-fed, dying not from bullets but from exhaustion and frost. And behind them, in Russia itself, unrest began to grow. A nation stretched too far, breaking slowly from within. Far to the south, the Allies sought another path. In 1915, British and French leaders dreamed of breaking the stalemate by striking at the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally. Their plan was bold: to force the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, and open the way to Russia. So began the Gallipoli campaign. Men from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand landed on the rocky beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They faced cliffs bristling with Ottoman defenders, trenches carved into stone, rifles and machine guns waiting. The landings turned to chaos. Boats grounded in shallow water. Soldiers waded through surf under fire. On the beaches, bodies piled. The sea itself turned red. For months, they clung to the cliffs, fighting in heat, flies, thirst. Disease spread. Food rotted. The Ottomans, led by a young commander named Mustafa Kemal, held firm. In the end, the Allies withdrew. Gallipoli became a graveyard, a symbol of wasted courage, of broken plans, of nations learning that this war would not yield to quick victories. The war also spread into the deserts. The Ottoman Empire, though weakened, still commanded vast lands. In Mesopotamia, British and Indian troops marched up the Tigris, only to be trapped at Kut, forced into surrender. In the Sinai and Palestine, cavalry and camels crossed the sand, clashing in a world of mirages and heat. There were whispers of revolt, too. In the Arabian desert, tribes rose against Ottoman rule, guided by the dream of independence, and aided by British officers, men like T.E. Lawrence. The desert became a stage of ambushes, raids, and promises that would echo long after the war's end. Even Africa was drawn into the conflict. In the colonies of Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, soldiers were recruited or compelled to fight. Carriers marched through jungles and savannas, bearing supplies for armies not their own. Skirmishes broke out in German East Africa, in Cameroon, in Southwest Africa. The people of Africa, many with no stake in Europe's quarrels, found themselves entangled in it, nonetheless. Some fought bravely, others were pressed into labor. The war scarred the continent, leaving behind graves far from the Western Front, graves often forgotten. The oceans, too, became battlegrounds. The Royal Navy blockaded Germany, strangling its trade, cutting off food and supplies. Hunger spread across German towns, silent and relentless. German U-boats slipped beneath the waves, striking back with torpedoes. Merchant ships went down, sailors and civilians alike drowning in cold waters. In 1915, the great liner Lusitania was sunk, more than 1,000 lives lost, a signal to the world that nowhere was safe. The sea was wide, but no longer free. It had become another front in a war with no boundaries. The war drew men from across the empires. From India, soldiers marched to fight in France, Mesopotamia, and Gallipoli. From Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, troops crossed oceans to join the struggle. From Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and Indochina, colonial soldiers fought in trenches far from home, their voices and faces strange to the European countryside. They fought bravely. They suffered equally. Yet their stories were often silenced, their sacrifices overshadowed by those of the great powers. The war was not only Europe's, it was theirs too. By 1916, there was no corner untouched. The battlefields stretched across continents. The empires had dragged their colonies into the abyss. The seas churned with submarines. The skies, once the realm of birds alone, now roared with fragile planes dropping bombs. It was not one war anymore. It was many wars, interwoven, feeding each other, devouring nations. The world itself was engulfed. And yet, for all its vastness, for all its reach, the war gave nothing but ruin. The Eastern Front bled, Gallipoli failed, the deserts burned, the oceans drowned, and still the Western Front remained, unmoved, unbroken, unending. The world was on fire, but the fire gave no light. The Great War was not only fought with men and horses, with rifles and bayonets, it was fought with machines. Never before had industry joined battles so completely. Factories became as important as generals. Assembly lines fed the front with rifles, shells, gas masks, barbed wire, steel helmets. The war was no longer a clash of armies, it was a contest of nations' capacity to manufacture death. The age of the machine had truly arrived. The gun was no longer a weapon wielded by one man. It was now a weapon wielded by hundreds, by thousands. Artillery, the king of battle, ruled the Western Front. Cannons the size of houses roared, shaking the ground for miles. Shells whistled through the sky, then struck with the force of thunderbolts. Villages were erased in moments. Hills disappeared. Forests vanished. Men lived in constant fear of the shell. There was no defense, no warning. 1 second, silence. The next, fire, steel, and nothingness. More soldiers died under artillery than by any other means. The war became a storm of shells, a storm that never ceased. If artillery ruled the distance, the machine gun ruled the ground. Set upon tripods, cooled with water, fed by belts of ammunition, they poured out bullets in endless streams. A single gun could stop hundreds of men. It was the end of the charge, the end of gallant advance. Rows of soldiers marching into fire were cut down in seconds. Cavalry, once the pride of every army, fell useless before the gun's unblinking eye. The machine gun turned courage into futility. It turned the battlefield into slaughter. And then there was the wire, simple, cheap, silent. Stretched across no man's land, it snared the living as surely as it guarded the dead. Soldiers, advancing under fire, found themselves tangled, helpless, cut by steel. Machine guns waited for them there. Barbed wire was not a weapon of killing, but of trapping. It held men long enough for death to find them. In April 1915, at Ypres, a new terror drifted across the battlefield. A pale greenish cloud carried by the wind, chlorine gas. Men coughed, clawed at their throats, collapsed as their lungs filled with liquid. Horses screamed and fell. Panic spread through the trenches. Soon came other gases, phosgene, deadlier still, which blistered skin, blinded eyes, burned the body from within. Gas masks followed, strange and insect-like, but the fear remained. Every shift in the wind, every strange mist in the distance could mean death. Gas was invisible, silent, unpredictable. It was war made into a nightmare. Above the trenches, the sky became a new battlefield. At first, aircraft were scouts, fragile machines of wood and cloth. But soon they carried rifles, then machine guns, then bombs. The dogfight was born. Duels in the air, spiraling dances of death. The names of aces became legends. The Red Baron, soaring in his crimson plane. Yet for most pilots, life was short, their machines fragile, their chances of survival slim. For the first time, war had entered the heavens. The sky itself had become a place of killing. In 1916, at the Somme, another new shape appeared. Lumbering across the mud, armored, belching smoke, came the tank. Slow, clumsy, breaking down often, but unstoppable by bullets. Men who faced them spoke of monsters crawling toward them, iron beasts grinding over wire, crushing trenches, spitting fire from their guns. They were not perfect, they were not yet decisive, but they were a beginning. A glimpse of wars yet to come. Artillery, machine guns, wire, gas, planes, tanks. Together they created a new kind of war, a war of industry, a war of science, a war that consumed men like fuel. No strategy, no bravery, no tradition could stand against them. The old world of generals in plumed hats, of cavalry and banners was gone. In its place was the factory, the machine, the laboratory. The war was no longer fought only on fields and in trenches. It was fought in steel mills, in chemical plants, in shipyards. Every rivet, every bullet, every drop of poison, another step deeper into the abyss. The technology of death had outpaced the technology of life. And in the mud of the Western Front, men learned what it meant to live in the shadow of machines. By 1917, the war had already lasted 3 years. 3 years of trenches, mud, and blood. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded, lost, or broken. Yet the war continued, with no clear end in sight. At home, families waited in silence, empty chairs at dinner tables, fields untended, children growing without fathers, bread lines stretched long. Hunger crept into every village. The promise of quick victory was gone. What remained was waiting. A waiting that had no answer, no mercy, no escape. In the trenches, soldiers lived not like warriors, but like shadows. Sleep was stolen in brief moments. Food was scarce, water fouled. Lice crawled in uniforms. Rats grew fat on corpses. Shellfire rained day after day, week after week, until men grew numb. Some stopped speaking. Some wandered in silence, hollow-eyed, broken in spirit. Others trembled uncontrollably, what doctors called shell shock. Bravery had not vanished, but faith had. Faith in leaders, in nations, in the war itself. In 1917, across the front, whispers spread. Whispers of refusal. French soldiers, exhausted by futile offensives, began to disobey. They would fight if attacked, but no longer would they march forward into certain death. It was not cowardice, it was survival. The mutinies were quiet, not violent. Songs replaced gunfire. Men stayed in their trenches, unwilling to sacrifice themselves for illusions of glory. For the first time, the armies themselves seemed to rebel against the very idea of war. Far to the east, another empire cracked, the Russian Empire. For years, Russian soldiers had fought without boots, without rifles, sometimes without food. Millions had died in fruitless battles. At home, the people starved. In 1917, the pressure broke. First came the February Revolution. The Tsar, Nicholas II, forced to abdicate, ending centuries of monarchy. Then, in October, a second revolution, the Bolsheviks seizing power, promising peace, land, and bread. Russia collapsed into chaos, into civil war, and for the first time a great power left the battlefield, retreating from the slaughter. The Eastern Front grew silent, but the silence was ominous. A new world was being born from the ruins. As one power left the war, another entered. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At first, its army was small, untested, but America was rich in resources, in factories, in men. Ship after ship crossed the Atlantic, bringing supplies, weapons, fresh soldiers. The arrival of the Americans breathed life into weary allies. a promise that perhaps, at last, the tide might turn. Yet for the soldiers still in the mud, salvation felt far away. By late 1917, the war was not merely a conflict of armies, but a war against time itself. Could the soldiers endure another winter in the trenches? Could nations feed their starving populations? Could empires survive the weight of despair? The cracks were spreading. In morale, in governments, in societies themselves. The war had begun as a surge of pride, a march of banners, a call to honor. Now it had become something else. A question whispered in the dark. How much longer can this go on? The answer would come soon, but it would not come gently. It was the spring of 1918. Germany was running out of time. With Russia gone from the war, German generals moved their armies westward, hoping for one last chance to break the stalemate. They launched a massive offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. For weeks, the Germans surged forward, breaking through Allied lines, pushing closer to Paris. Villages fell, trenches were abandoned. Once again, it seemed as if the war might tilt in Germany's favor. But each gain came at a terrible cost. The German army bled itself dry. Hungry, exhausted, weakened by years of blockade, they were advancing, but they were also dying. By summer, the tide began to turn. The Allies, now reinforced by fresh American troops, launched counterattacks. At the Second Battle of the Marne, the German advance stalled. Then it broke. The Allies began pushing forward, village by village, trench by trench. The 100 Days offensive followed. Relentless, grinding, merciless. The Allies advanced not in sudden victories, but in steady, crushing weight. German soldiers retreated, step by step. The dream of victory dissolved. What remained was survival. Behind the front, the old empires cracked apart. Austria-Hungary, once vast and proud, shattered under the strain. Its peoples, long suppressed, declared independence. Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats. The empire dissolved into fragments, like glass breaking under pressure. The Ottoman Empire crumbled too, losing its lands in the Middle East, driven back by Allied armies and Arab revolts. Even Germany itself wavered. Hunger stalked its cities, strikes erupted, soldiers deserted. The government faced protests, riots, whispers of revolution. The war had not just broken armies, it had broken nations. By November 1918, the end was clear. Germany could no longer fight. Its leaders sought an armistice, a ceasefire to stop the bleeding. But on the front lines, the killing did not stop immediately. Every day, men still fell. Every hour, shells still thundered. Even on the morning of November 11th, soldiers died in the mud, unaware that peace was only hours away. Then came the moment, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The guns fell silent. After 4 years, the noise of war, the endless thunder of artillery, the screams, the chaos, was replaced by a silence so vast, so sudden, that it felt unreal. Men stood in their trenches, staring at the quiet. Some wept, some laughed, some collapsed in relief. But for many, there was no joy, only emptiness. Because when the guns stopped, the dead did not return. The war had ended. But the peace was fragile, uncertain, and cruel. The Treaty of Versailles would soon redraw borders, punish nations, and sow seeds of resentment. The Russian Revolution had already unleashed a new force, communism. The grief of millions, the hunger for revenge, the collapse of empires, all of it pointed to an uneasy future. A world had been destroyed in 1914. By 1918, another was being born. But it was a world haunted by memory. by the trenches, the gas, the slaughter, the silence of the armistice. The Great War was over, and yet it had only set the stage for darker storms to come. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of the war would never fade. When the guns fell silent in November of 1918, the world exhaled. For the first time in 4 years, the earth knew quiet. But silence is not peace. Silence is absence. The space left behind when so much has been destroyed. Villages lay in ruins. Fields were cratered and poisoned. Forests had vanished beneath shells. Millions of bodies remained in shallow graves or unmarked fields known only to the earth itself. And in every city, every town, every family, there were absences, empty chairs, missing names, lives that would never return. The world was hushed, not from relief, but from grief. Before 1914, there was belief in progress, in science, in civilization. The world seemed to be advancing toward reason, toward enlightenment, toward peace. The Great War shattered that illusion. Science had not saved mankind. It had created new ways to kill. Poison gas, machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks, bombers. Civilization had not restrained barbarity. It had organized it, rationalized it, mass-produced it. The war revealed a darker truth, that human progress was fragile, and that beneath the veneer of order lay chaos, cruelty, and despair. Those who returned from the trenches were never the same. Many were broken in body, scarred, blinded, crippled. Many more were broken in spirit, haunted by nightmares, sleeplessness, sudden terrors. What was once called shell shock, we now call trauma. Writers, poets, artists, they gave voice to this grief. They called themselves the lost generation. Their works were filled with emptiness, with questions, with a sense that meaning itself had collapsed in the mud of Flanders and Verdun. An entire generation had gone to war, believing in honor, in duty, in glory. They came back believing in nothing. The war remade the map of the earth. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, all were gone. In their place rose fragile new nations, drawn by pen strokes at peace conferences, but unstable, uncertain, vulnerable. Colonial powers expanded their reach in Africa and the Middle East, redrawing borders with little thought to the peoples who lived there. Seeds of future conflict were planted in the sand. And in Russia, a new force emerged, the Bolsheviks. Communism was no longer an idea but a state, and its shadow stretched outward, threatening the old order of Europe. The war had not ended history. It had only shifted it into a more dangerous shape. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, declared peace, but it was a peace built on punishment. Germany was stripped of land, of colonies, of pride. Crippled with debts it could not pay, humiliated before the world. The people felt betrayed, by enemies abroad and by leaders at home. In that bitterness, resentment took root. Resentment that would in time grow into something darker. The war that was meant to end all wars had instead sown the seeds of the next. And yet, the war changed more than borders, more than politics. It changed how humanity thought about itself. It changed art, literature, music, philosophy. It changed how people looked at faith, at progress, at the future. It was a wound, deep, unhealed, unforgettable. A scar that marked the 20th century and shaped the lives of everyone who followed. From that silence in 1918, everything that came after was altered. The Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the coming of another world war. The very world we live in now was forged in that moment. The First World War was more than a conflict. It was a turning point, a fracture in history. Before it, the 19th century lingered, a world of empires, of confidence, of order. After it, the 20th century began, a world of chaos, of ideology, of unending struggle. It was called the Great War. It was called the war to end all wars. But history remembers it differently. It was the war that changed everything. And though the guns have long been silent, their echoes remain. Still whispering in our world, still shaping our future, still reminding us of what was lost.